we are taught to trust in science. We place our greatest hope and vulnerability in the hands of doctors, believing that centuries of progress have given us cures and relief. But what if the healing hand of history was, in reality, a source of unimaginable horror? What if the most respected medical practices of the past were little more than legalized torture based on utterly flawed and bizarre logic? Welcome back to Omen Myths. Today, we are not just looking at bizarre historical facts. We are taking a journey into the twisted, millennia-spanning practices of medicine, diving deep into two specific procedures, one surgical, one chemical, that defined the intersection of hope, ignorance, and suffering. The practice of trepanation and the global reliance on the poison that is Mercury. Prepare yourself, because the things humanity has done in the name of healing are often far more shocking than the diseases themselves. This is 5,000 years of madness, trepanation, Mercury, and history's most horrific medical cures. Part 1. The Hole in the Head. The Dark History of Trepanation, the Surgical Absurdity. Trepanation is the surgical process of drilling, scraping, or cutting a hole into the human skull. It is the single oldest surgical procedure for which we have undeniable physical evidence. And the incredible, terrifying truth is that it was practiced successfully and sometimes repeatedly by cultures across every continent and spanning at least 5,000 years, if not more. We're talking ancient Peru, Neolithic Europe, early African tribes, and even into the early 20th century in remote areas. The simple fact that people survived this is a medical miracle in itself, but the true horror is why they did it. The early logic, spirits, and pressure. The earliest motivations for trepanation are rooted in what we would call spiritual or supernatural belief. Ancient folks didn't really think about tumors or hematomas like we do today. If a person was suffering from seizures, headaches, mental illness, or even just acting strangely, the problem was often attributed to malevolent spirits trapped within the skull. The hole was meant to be an exit strategy. It was a doorway for the demons to escape and for the person's good self to return. In Neolithic Europe, evidence shows the practice was often performed on children and young men, and the precision of the drilling suggests not just a ritualistic intent, but a genuine, desperate medical attempt. The fact that the bone around the hole often shows signs of healing, sometimes extensive healing, suggesting the patient lived 4 years afterward, means they were doing something right, or at least surviving the brutal process. Think about that crude instrument. No anesthesia, and the survival rate was remarkably high. The procedure across civilizations, the methods evolved, but the core horror remained. The Incas of Peru, who practiced trepanation extensively, were arguably the most skilled. They used copper, bronze, or obsidian tools, scraping away layers of bone until the protective layer around the brain was exposed. Their motivations were often more grounded than spirit exorcism. We see evidence of trepanation being used to treat head injuries, fractures, depressed skull wounds, and probably subdural hematomatous blood clots pressing on the brain. In the chaos of ritual warfare or blunt force trauma, relieving the pressure was, surprisingly, a logical step. They understood the connection between brain swelling and death, even if they couldn't name the anatomy. The evidence from Peruvian skulls is staggering. Some skulls show not one, but multiple holes, all with clear signs of healing. This means the patient survived the first procedure, and then, due to the return of symptoms or a second injury, elected to or was forced to undergo the procedure again. This speaks volumes about the desperation of their suffering, or perhaps the compelling belief in the ritual's effectiveness. As we move into the Greek and Roman eras, the practice became slightly more refined and based on the concept of humoral theory, the idea that the body was governed by 4 primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Trepanation was used to relieve pressure or to allow bad humors to exit the head. Hippocrates himself, the father of modern medicine, wrote about the procedure, advising its use for serious head wounds. The instruments became specialized crude hand drills, bone saws, and levers, making the procedure more standardized, but arguably no less terrifying given the lack of proper pain management. The sound alone of a saw cutting through bone must have been a horror beyond words. During the medieval period, the practice largely declined in Western Europe, becoming a rare, high-risk procedure reserved only for extreme head trauma. However, Its spiritual root never completely died. It quietly persisted in various forms, often as a desperate, last resort folk remedy. The great resurgence of trepanation happened much later, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks in part to the rise of phrenology. Phrenology, the pseudoscience that claimed personality traits were determined by bumps on the skull, briefly brought surgical interest back to the cranium, though the holes were often smaller and more exploratory. But the truly bizarre return of trepanation arrived with individuals like Bart Hughes and the proponents of self-trepanation in the 1960s and 70s. This modern, voluntary movement was based on the utterly unscientific belief that drilling a hole in the skull, sometimes referred to as a brain tat, increased blood volume to the brain, which would then enhance consciousness, unlock creativity, and allow one to achieve a perpetual state of high or spiritual clarity. The logic was that since a baby's skull has soft spots, closing these spots in adulthood somehow traps mental energy. This extreme self-inflicted medical horror was entirely based on misguided philosophical and psychedelic theories, resulting in gruesome self-surgery and dangerous, life-threatening infections. The lasting horror of trepanation isn't just the sheer brutality of the act itself, but its persistence across thousands of years, driven by everything from demon exorcism to misguided spiritual quests. It is a physical scar left on the history of medicine, proving that sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a disease is a doctor with an idea and a drill. Now, if cutting a hole into the skull wasn't enough, let's explore the chemical horror that was considered a miracle cure for over 400 years, the poisonous reign of mercury in medicine. This element, known today for its extreme toxicity, was once prescribed for everything from melancholy to syphilis, creating a medical landscape so dangerous. The treatment was often worse than the disease. Part 2. The universal poison, the chemical horror of mercury in medicine. Mercury, to the modern mind, the word conjures images of broken thermometers, environmental pollution, and severe, irreversible neurological damage. It is a known neurotoxin and poison, but step back into the pages of history, and mercury in various forms was regarded as one of the most powerful, versatile, and trusted compounds in the entire medical arsenal. For centuries, across continents and cultures, this element was a literal drug of choice for healers and physicians. The alchemical allure, the obsession with mercury begins, as many strange medical paths do, with alchemy. Mercury, or quicksilver, fascinated early scientists because it was the only known liquid metal. It could dissolve gold, it never tarnished, and it moved in a mesmerizing, almost living way. Alchemists considered it a key component in the search for the philosopher's stone, the element that could turn base metals into gold and, crucially, grant eternal life. This mystical reputation quickly crossed into medicine. If mercury was powerful enough to change gold, surely it was powerful enough to change the human body. The great mercury cure-all. By the time of the Renaissance, mercury had become a universal cure-all. It was used orally, topically, and even injected or fumigated. It was often administered in a compound called calomel mercurous chloride, which was considered relatively mild, or in the form of cinnabar mercuric sulfide, which gave a beautiful red pigment but was highly toxic. The list of diseases it was prescribed for is dizzying, depression, constipation, skin rashes, intestinal worms, and general melancholy. The logic was often based on the principle of purging. Mercury is a powerful laxative and diuretic. It would literally rush through the patient's system, causing extreme vomiting, diarrhea, and profuse sweating. The patient and the doctor would observe this intense purging and conclude that the illness, the bad humors, or the impurities were being driven out of the body. The patient felt violently ill, but the doctor believed they were responding dramatically to the cure. The syphilis epidemic. The use of mercury truly exploded with the arrival of syphilis in Europe in the late 15th century. This new, terrifying venereal disease had no known cure, and doctors were desperate. Mercury was proposed as the ultimate aggressive treatment. The patient would be subjected to intensive mercury treatments, often through topical application or mercurial fumigation, sitting in a steam box where mercury was heated, causing the patient to inhale the toxic vapors. The treatment was hellish. Patients would experience severe swelling of the mouth and gums, loss of teeth, excruciating pain, and excessive drooling up to a gallon of saliva a day. The foul odor emanating from the patient due to the decaying tissues was known as mercurial fever. Many patients did not die from syphilis. They died from mercury poisoning. The symptoms of the cure: tremors, neurological damage. Delirium was so terrible that it became a common saying that a night with venous syphilis led to a life with mercury. The horrifying side effects did not deter doctors for centuries. Why? Because the patients sometimes appeared to get better. Syphilis has stages, and the disease often goes into remission naturally. When a patient went into remission after a brutal mercury treatment, the doctor and the patient credited the poison. The treatment was considered successful because it was so aggressive that it must have killed the disease, even if it nearly killed the patient. The long-term effects were tragic. Chronic exposure led to the terrifying neurological condition known as erethism or Mad Hatter disease, because hat makers frequently used mercury nitrate in the production of felt. Symptoms included uncontrollable tremors, pathological shyness, mood swings, memory loss, and severe psychosis, a descent into debilitating madness. This is the horror behind the phrase "Mad as a Hatter." The medical community slowly began to recognize the toxicity, but the practice was so entrenched that it continued well into the 19th century, particularly in dentistry, where mercury amalgams were widely used, and in children's medicine, where calomel was given for teething and constipation. The end of mercury's reign as a miracle drug came not through a sudden revelation, but through the slow, undeniable accumulation of evidence from medical reformers who dared to question the tradition. The development of antibiotics in the 20th century finally provided a true non-poisonous cure for syphilis and other infections, eliminating the need for such desperate, toxic measures. The legacy of mercury in medicine is a haunting reminder that in the history of science, the loudest and most aggressive treatment is often the one that gains the most credibility, regardless of the patient's actual outcome. It is a chapter of medical history defined by suffering, where desperation convinced educated people to ingest a known poison in the hope of a miraculous cure. The stories of trepanation and mercury in medicine are just two examples of how thin the line is between healing and horror in the historical context. These procedures, barbaric by today's standards, were once the height of scientific thought, driven by a desperate need to conquer illness in an age of profound ignorance. They leave us with a stark truth. Sometimes, the greatest enemy to human health wasn't the disease itself, but the terrifying belief that a violent, life-threatening measure was the only path to a cure. We survived these horrors, but the scars they left on the human story are permanent. Which of these horrific historical practices shocked you the most? The literal drilling of the skull or the poisoning with quicksilver? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more terrifying, true stories from the darker corners of history. Thanks for watching Omen Myths.